All right, let's see. All right, Uta, can you go ahead and unmute?
We'll get her set up. Just one moment, please.
Okay.
Hi, Gail and Tom.
There we go. Okay. All right, I'll be doing the introduction. So, a writer from youth and an MA graduate in comparative literature from the University of Rochester, German-born Uta Carson published her first prose piece in 1977. Carson's story, The Fall, won Outrider Press's grand prize and appeared in its short story and poetry anthology, A Walk Through My Garden, in 2007. Her second novel, In Transit, was published in 2008. Her poems have appeared in numerous journals and magazines in the US and abroad. She received the 2018 Ovidiu Bector Literary Award from the Anticus Multicultural Association in Constanta, Romania. In 2018, the Plainview Press nominated her for the Pushcart Award Prize. Today, she will be reading from her newly published book, Gypsy Spirit. Okay.
Is it my turn now? All right.
Yes.
First of all, I'm so thrilled that so many of you are able to Zoom in, and we might still have some who will join us later. I want to thank, first of all, of course, Becky, for your introduction, and the entire team of Malvern Books for putting this together and hosting it. And of course, their Pam Knight, publisher of the Plainview Press in Austin, who put together and published this wonderful book. I can't, my family has to wait for later, because if I start on that way down, I get teary-eyed and then I can't read it. So I do that later. I want, first of all, to draw your attention to the book cover. Can we show the book cover? Can you see the book cover? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see the book cover. Gypsy Spirit. A book cover tells you something about a book. It draws your attention to the nature of a book. In a sense, a book cover is the spirit of a book. Now, Gypsy Spirit. Why Gypsy? I have always been fascinated by the tradition and the culture of the gypsies. They are wanderers, they are clairvoyant, and they have the ability to look below the surface of things to the marvelous unconscious. And they are also survivors. And there are many stories of survival in this book. Now, this book does not only have survival stories. It has stories about animals. It has lots of good stories for teachers. It has stories for parents, for historians, a variety of stories about loss and love. I want to read you today 3 stories. 2 short, what we call with our lingo, flash stories, and 1 a little longer in the middle. And then I hope I can talk to many of you after the reading. So relax, and this is our first story. All 3 stories, by the way, are based on true events. Hope Diamond. It fits. She pounded the left heel of her travel-weary brown shoes. In its hollow, my grandmother had just buried a diamond in the rough. A few days before, sitting on the steps of their ramshackle cottage near the diamond fields of the Namib Desert, where my grandfather was an overseer, she had spotted an object in the sand. The African sun had reflected off its glittering surface. British freighters anchored in the Bay of Lüderitz were ready to transport German settlers back home following the English overtake of Southwest Africa in 1919. The diamond mine workers had already been evacuated. Back in her native Germany, my grandmother stored the shoes among other valuables in her closet. You never know when we might need them, she told my mother. A war later, fleeing invading Russian troops, my grandmother trekked westward wearing her trusty, worn brown African shoes. In the icy winter of 1946, I contracted diphtheria. Although I lived in a cocoon of familial love, infected children were forcibly quarantined in a provisional hospital by the American authorities. Have a heart, my distraught mother pleaded. We have never been apart. She was summarily ushered out. I was delirious and barely aware of what was going on. I vaguely recalled crying Mutti during nights of feverish demon dreams as children around me died in droves. Once I threw my arms around a nurse thinking she was my mother. Medicines were scarce and penicillin was available only on the black market. There was little hope for me. My grandmother made contact with a street smart volunteer in the hospital's storage room where care packages containing powdered milk and instant soup arrived from abroad. Then one night, she pried off the heel of her left shoe, lifted the diamond out and spit polished it with her handkerchief. Your time has come, she whispered. And then she cloaked herself in a shabby grey coat. Under cover of darkness, she descended into the underworld of our city, where smugglers eagerly exchanged the new wonder drug for the most precious stone. Just in time, sighed the doctor at the children's ward. I soon recovered. I was left with a fear of separation, a damaged heart valve, and an amazing story. My grandmother had to recount her adventure again and again. It was the ending that I envisioned with vivid imagination. Omi, I told her, tell it again, tell it. And so she did. After being led through tunnels to a dimly lit shed, a bespectacled man examined the diamond under a magnifying glass and exclaimed, "It's real." He then reached up to a shelf behind him and pulled down a box with black lettering, penicillin. He dismissed me abruptly, urging me to go quickly before we were found out. My grandmother assured me that she had not been frightened until that moment. But then I realized, she confessed, that I might be followed and robbed. She hurried away, clutching the box of tablets to her chest, then stuffing them into her undergarments. But where? I asked with childish curiosity. Close to my heart, she murmured. True story. Saved my life. All right, now we're going to the little bit longer one in the middle. This is a story about brotherly love, about my two uncles, Hubertus and Hayo, my mother's brothers. It is also about loyalty and mainly also about inclusion. The story is called He's My Brother. I start with a quote from Heinrich Heine, who was a German writer and poet, and he wrote in 1820. That was only the prologue. When books are burned, eventually people will be burned as well. The autumn air had deepened and thick mist was drifting through a Swiss valley near Lausanne. Biting winds whipped over the mountains. Madame Juliette, a slender woman wearing tan slacks and a blue mohair sweater, her gray hair pulled back in a chignon, sat on a flower-patterned sofa in her oak-paneled study. A sturdy cardboard box stood next to her. It was crammed with loose photos, family pictures, landscape shots, and vacation mementos. A fire crackled in the large stone fireplace. Juliette's former teacher, Dr. Schreiber, was visiting from America. With bushy white hair and a mustache, he bore a certain likeness to Mark Twain, but he had shrunk in stature since they last met years ago. He rocked calmly in his chair, his eyes sharply focused on Juliette. Under his steady gaze, she felt like the shy student who had been dazzled by his lectures and intimidated by his kind but demeaning demeanor. Dr. Schreiber had come to assemble a collection of stories and articles about his former school in Berlin and its pupils. As they talked, Juliette's small hands rifled through a pile of photographs. With squirrel-like dexterity, she picked up one picture then another, discarding them until her face twitched with recognition. "Here," she whispered. Dr. Schreiber reached for the photo and studied it at arm's length. Then, uncharacteristically emotional, he said, "Oh, I remember Hayo well. It seems like only yesterday, but it had happened a long time ago." And Dr. Schreiber began to reminisce. Following the 1933 book burning on the Bebelplatz at Humboldt University, my worries about the National Socialist regime mounted. I considered accepting your father's offer to fund a new school for me here in Lausanne. But I could not bring myself to dissolve my beloved school in Berlin. "What made you change your mind?" Juliette interjected. "It wasn't that I changed my mind. I simply waited too long and the Nazis closed me down." Dr. Schreiber then recalled an incident involving Hayo that occurred a few days before the Kristallnacht in 1939. "I was standing at the window of my study, watching students cross the street on their way to our school, when I saw an SS officer shove Jakob Bernstein into the gutter. Hayo ran to the boy's side, lifted him up, and exchanged a few words with the officer, and then escorted Jakob through the door of our school. When I later questioned Jakob about what had happened, he told me that Hayo had witnessed the incident as he jumped off the streetcar at our school stop. He ran over to help Jakob up. As Hayo brushed Jakob off and straightened his cap, the SS officer turned on him. 'Judenfreund, eh? Friend of the Jews?' As Hayo brushed Jakob off and straightened his cap again, he demanded menacingly. Hayo, however, replied with his disarming smile, 'I am Baron von Lüttwitz, officer, and this is my brother.' Dr. Schreiber pondered Hayo's remark momentarily before continuing. The boys did somehow resemble each other. Both were trim and had chiseled profiles. However, Jakob had begun to affect a slouching, and shuffling gait whenever he spotted black jackboots or men in dark uniforms. Fear had seized him after his epileptic brother was forcefully institutionalized by the Nazi health authorities, and he had witnessed his father, a respected jeweler in town, being roughed up by a street gang, shouting anti-Semitic slurs. Jakob admitted that he was astonished that after hesitating for a moment, the SS officer had let the matter lie and walked away. It is curious, don't you think? Juliet asked. Yes and no, Dr. Schreiber explained. The Nazis both loathed and admired aristocrats and still handled them with kid gloves. It was in the wake of this incident that I contacted Hayo's mother, a Christian Scientist and pacifist, to seek her permission to ask Hayo if he would like to join me in establishing a new school in Switzerland. Dr. Schreiber mused. Hayo was a born leader with a sunny disposition and compassion for others. He was always eager to help, but never ingratiating. I knew he would set a perfect example for my new school. Juliet knew this part of the story well, and her cheeks flushed as she broke in. And Hayo accepted your invitation and came here for a few carefree years. We studied together, rode our horses through meadows at dawn and dusk, and wonder of wonders, we fell in love. Hayo was in my older brother's class and was often invited to our home. My parents sometimes interrupted our adolescent conversations with their worries about what was happening in Germany. But we were young and optimistic about life, and my parents often opened their mountain chalet to us and a group of friends from school on weekends. It became Hayo's favorite place in Switzerland. He was always full of vitality and good humor at the chalet. Were there ever signs of a change in his mood? Dr. Schreiber asked. Not at first, Juliet replied. He did make regular visits home to Germany. He had a married sister and an older brother there. Upon his return from those visits, he sometimes seemed distracted and gloomy. Then, when his brother-in-law was killed in France in 1940, he began to question whether it was right for him to remain in relative safety in Switzerland. We were startled. We knew that Hayo's older brother, Hubertus, had been drafted when he graduated from boarding school at Castle Zallen. Serious and reclusive by nature, he was not cut out to be a soldier, so he initially was assigned to a desk job. Hayo described his brother to me as quite different from himself, but he asserted that he had been very close from childhood on. Hayo was the gregarious one and still full of mischief. I remember sitting around a fireplace near the chalet one evening as he told us stories about how he often coaxed his brother into various fooleries. Once, while guests were arriving for an elegant dinner at their grandfather's estate, Hayo took Hubertus with him to cut long strings of ivy from the walls of the manor house, which they then proceeded to wrap around the guest room toilet seats. Their grandfather clearly loved the two boys, but that night he gave them a whipping with his riding crop. Juliet laughed as she recounted this story. Hayo often had some such prank up his sleeve. While Hayo wrestled with his qualms of conscience, Dr. Schreiber interjected, I was getting ready to leave for America. Your father had it all arranged. I now loved my school in Lausanne and stayed as long as I dared. But Switzerland no longer seemed safe in 1942. Late that summer, Hayo was sitting in front of me, stooped forward, his head buried in his hands, telling me about his decision to return to Germany for good. Hubertus had been sent to the front. He is my brother, he sighed. I cannot abandon him. Hayo did not even respond when I implored him to immigrate with me to America. Juliet was now in tears. We all tried. My parents even attempted to bribe him by holding out the possibility that he could join our firm. We reminded him that he would be drafted as soon as he crossed the border, but he only shook his head. I must go, Juliet. I simply must. A single weekend remained before his departure. I cannot describe it. It's so personal. Please, Juliet, do try. It's very important. My editor, that youngster Jakob, who is now a successful publisher, is waiting for Hayo's story, which will appear in print along with a few other recollections soon after our return. Juliet let the moment pass, then took a long breath in and out and began to speak as though in a kind of reverie. In late summer, our forests teem with delicious wild blueberries, and bluebells sway in the balmy breeze in the meadows. The days are pleasant, and the evenings refreshingly cool, often crisp enough for a fire in the cast iron stove. We had hiked up to our hideout, my parents' chalet. Hayo was splitting wood for the evening fire when I snapped this last picture of him, shirtless, his blonde hair tousled, axe swinging high above an upturned block of wood. In retrospect, an awful omen. But at the time, I could only admire the well-sculptured body of my first love. After a simple supper with milk from the fat meadow cows, bowls filled up to the brim with blueberries we had picked that afternoon, and crusty brown bread with chunks of cheese, Hayo brought a bottle of wine to the steps of the chalet. As we sipped the wine, bells from the village below began to ring. Like wedding bells, I remember thinking. We listened and held each other tight until the sounds no longer echoed through the mountains and night enveloped us. The rest of the story is a sad memory. Hayo left Juliet and Switzerland, and, as was foreseen, was drafted soon after he reached his homeland. Like his brother before him, he was deployed to the Russian front. By sheer coincidence, they met one last time. Their units had been stationed in proximity to each other near Kiev for a short reprieve from the fighting. In the mess hall, Hubertus spotted Hayo from behind by the white lock of neck hair that had marked him from childhood. Flinging their arms around each other, Hubertus gasped, "What are you doing here, Hayo? I believed you safe in Switzerland." To which Hayo replied simply, "I could not leave you here alone, brother." As their separate companies moved deep into Russia during the extremely cold winter of 1944, the supply line severed behind them. Both brothers were killed. Hubertus was 21, Hayo 19. Hayo's comrades discovered a photo of Juliet and a letter to his mother, my grandmother, in his shirt pocket. The letter contained a simple message. If it had not been for my idyllic childhood and carefree youth, I could not survive this hellhole. Evening had then dimmed the study, silence lingered until Juliet stood up and walked over to the fire. Dr. Schreiber also rose and stepped to her side, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. I thank you, my dear, for this painful, beautiful look back. May I borrow this photograph? I promise to return it to you with a copy of the book. And with that, the old teacher took his leave. After let that story sink in a little bit, again, I said we end with a short one, with a little bit more of a upbeat one. And this one is called Here I Stand. Maria was a shy 8th grader. When called upon to read aloud, her throat turned dry, her stomach queasy. Going to the blackboard in front of the whole class terrified her. She was a good speller, but when asked to write on the board, her hand would shake and the letters would tumble all over themselves. Maria was happiest when bent over her blue-lined notebook, earnestly composing stories about rabbits and horses and the antics of her puppets. Maria's small body was topped with a head of full brown hair, which her mother harnessed into 2 thick braids, and when time allowed, then coiled them around her head. The braids were a temptation for many of Maria's classmates, and when someone ran by her, a quick yank was inevitable. Maria's dreamy dark eyes filled with tears when the tugging was too harsh. Please don't do that, she would plead. Classroom setting was arranged so that the taller pupils sat in the back. Tiny Maria ended up in the very front row. Short, chubby Heinz sat right behind her. He was smart and, as an only child of wealthy parents, spoiled. He believed he could get away with any prank, and nobody seemed able to curb his non-stop talking. Physical punishment was permitted in German schools in the 1950s, so not all teachers used it. Mr. Bankwitz, a history and gym teacher, was the exception. When a girl misbehaved, Mr. Bankwitz had her stand at her desk with outstretched fingertips, which he smashed with a slender reed. The boys he took to the hallway and gave them a stinging lash or two across the bottom with a leather strap. Maria grew up in a loving family. Her parents had repeatedly petitioned against corporal punishment in the school. It's simply wrong, her mother explained. Maria had never even been spanked, and she winced every time she saw the swollen fingertips of her girlfriends. When a boy received a whipping, the sound of the strap made her recoil. She leaned very close to her notebook, her nose touching the pages, and covered her ears. She disliked having her hair pulled, but knew that if she reported it, she would have to witness the perpetrator's punishment. Being bullied was bad, but the whippings were worse. Heinz got a laugh out of the class every time he pulled Maria's braids. When she let out a plaintive, "Ouch!" he beamed triumphantly and turned to his approving audience. But he tormented Maria mostly before the start of class or after the closing bell had rung. Mr. Bankwitz was a canny observer who often arrived early on the school grounds and then lingered in the hallway. Several times he had watched Heinz from afar. One day, when Maria's hair was fluttering loose like a horse's mane, Heinz had more fun than ever, wrapping a few strands around his fingers and squealing, "Snagged you!" When Mr. Banquist entered the classroom, everybody scrambled to their seats. Slowly, he put his briefcase on the desk, then took out the book for the day's lesson and placed it face down. Peering over his glasses, he said firmly, "Heinz, do not do that again." About halfway through the hour, Mr. Banquist, while writing on the blackboard, glanced over his shoulder momentarily, just as Heinz took a quick pass at Maria's hair. Without a show of emotion, Mr. Banquist put the chalk down, walked to the cupboard, and retrieved the strap. "Heinz," he called, "out. Step outside." Heinz, who was unaccustomed to being disciplined, could not believe what he heard. He tried to explain, "I only brushed Maria's hair aside because she was blocking my view of the blackboard." "Step outside." Mr. Banquist was clearly irritated. Suddenly, the situation seemed serious. Heinz began to shake. "I will never do it again, Mr. Banquist, I promise." Mr. Banquist was not a patient man. "For the last time, Heinz, outside." Heinz lost his composure and sank to his knees. "Please, please don't." Mr. Banquist got hold of Heinz's shirt and lifted him like a limp kitten, steering him into the hallway. Heinz howled so loudly and pitifully that other teachers emerged from their rooms to see what was happening. When Heinz returned to the classroom, he hung his head and did not even wipe the tears from his cheeks. Witnessing Heinz's humiliation, courage surged up in Maria's fearful heart, and her mother's words echoed in her ears. Before she had merely been an observer, but now she felt implicated. Mr. Banquist opened his book and was about to pick up where he had left off when Maria's faint voice made him spin around. "I hate spankings," she stuttered haltingly. "What did you say, Maria?" "I hate spankings," she repeated, her voice quivering. Mr. Banquist was incredulous. "Apologize, Maria," he demanded. "I can't," she said, and stood up. Her words were clear, her voice steady. "You can't? Then take your seat and be quiet." Mr. Banquist's ears turned red with anger, and he seemed to lose his bearings. That a pupil, especially a girl, would dare to question his authority. "I can't do that either, Mr. Banquist." Maria was now composed, confident. Mr. Banquist took several steps toward her in a failed attempt to intimidate her, then suddenly turned, gathered up his books and briefcase, and left the room without a word, slamming the door behind him. A pencil rolled off a desk and clattered to the floor. Ordinarily, someone would have picked it up. Instead, the pencil rolled and rolled until it bumped into the far wall. Nobody moved a muscle. Maria remained standing, immobile as a statue, until the bell rang. Everyone rushed out except Heinz. He approached Maria. "Wow," he whispered, and then touched her hair ever so gently before running outside with the others to spread the word. All right, you heard 3 different stories, and we can now maybe go to some questions.
That was lovely. Okay, those were really wonderful. Now, I want to encourage everyone, if you have any questions, please put them into the chat and we'll be happy to talk some more about that. So anybody has anything, be sure and type something in.
Becky, can we also unmute ourselves and ask questions one at a time, or should we all chat in our questions?
Well, I mean, I think if you don't think it will be too confusing, we can unmute if people are more comfortable with that. But we do have one question in there. Is that from you? Or someone is already asking a question. It's just usually easier to handle if they're in the chat.
Sure, sounds good.
So we have one.
Will you tell the question?
Sure. What inspired you to write this book?
It's a collection of pretty much not all, but many of my stories, essays from when I started publishing in the 70s. And all the stories in here are published either in magazines or in anthologies, but spread around all the country and in different countries. And I wanted to have a book with everything collected. And then we came up, actually, our daughter Cecile, and with that we would find pictures that would match the stories. And that what made the book, I think, so difficult for Pam, but very rich and rewarding for us, that we collected stories for pictures for the stories. And we got already some lovely reviews about that.
Oh, okay. That's wonderful. There's another question that asks, does it cover certain years of your life? I think you kind of mentioned that a bit, but are there particular things that it covers, particular years, or you said it was all throughout?
It's not just my life. It covers also the lives of my parents, my grandparents. It covers a lot of the Second World War period. But there are also stories in there that are not just based on my life. And that I encounter that all the time, is what is fiction and what is nonfiction. And I've always prided myself that even in a fictional account, there is something, of course, a kernel of something personal in there, but you have to go beyond the personal to make it universal. And there are even some that are totally fictional, even so, of course, a kernel. There was maybe a conversation that I overheard, or a story or a snippet that I heard. It's like my first story that some of you like a lot already. It's about the story about the apples, the fall. And it's a fictional story. And the father in there is not my father, because my father was killed before I was even born. But people all the time think it's my father. And another story in the section on love. There's a story, Love Forever. I was sitting with somebody over lunch, and an acquaintance, and she told me the story and said, "Can you believe this?" And I rushed home and I wrote it. And I had a lot of responses, and I always asked myself, well, what was it about it? It's not about me. It was that it was touched something universal, whether it's real or imaginary. So that was one of the things that kind of flowed into the book. Anything else?
There's a question in the chat, Uta, from Tanya, about the story you've told before and written before about your grandmother. You asked her questions about would we always be cold? Would we always be hungry? Something like that. And she replied to you about her view on life. Can you tell that story? She's asking.
Well, my grandmother, as will also be very obvious in the book, had herself a very, very interesting life. She was a very wealthy aristocrat, the youngest child, and was sent on the maiden voyage of the Bremen to what was then Southwest Africa. She was stranded there because First World War broke out, and she had no way to even contact her parents. She stayed there, found my grandfather who was on a ranch in Africa, married him, had 2 children, and then came back to Germany after the English conquered Southwest Africa. So she became a very influential person in my life and an important storyteller. She would tell the stories about Africa. That's how I learned about Namibia, and we all traveled there when it became Namibia. We still have relatives in Namibia who intended to join us tonight. So she was extremely important to me also when we had to flee from the Russians, because the men were all either dead or drafted. So it was just my mother and my grandmother. And my mother, being a trained nurse, was immediately on the train that we took from the east to the west occupied. So I was pretty much left with my grandmother for long stretches of time. And she was my rescue and my comfort. And there are 2 things. She was my rescue and my comfort. And it gave me the belief that I still hold today. If you have a secure childhood, that's why Joseph's story, when my uncle says, under these terrible conditions at Stalingrad, you can encounter a lot, you can survive a lot if you have that kind of background. And she gave me that. She gave me that security and that incredible background. But she also was there when I saw a lot of things. One of the stories in the book is on the train, when I first saw the wounded soldiers coming back from the front, and she and I were there in the hallway on chairs, and I asked her all these questions. And so the questions mounted when I was young, because we saw already so much death and dying and suffering. And I asked her, I said, is that what life is about? And is everybody always unhappy? Does everybody just encounter tragedies? And she said, no. What we encounter right now here between us, it's also real. And that stayed with me as well.
I don't know how to chat. Can I ask a question?
Please do, please do.
So I noticed that even in the reading of the last story about Maria and the lashings, so many of your stories have teaching moments in them. And I'm wondering if you built that into the history and the traditions that in your biography, if that was a conscious thing.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you asked that, because especially this is one of the good, I thought maybe somebody would ask why that story. It's not about that Germany in the 50s still had corporal punishment. That is a shock value. That's not it. The meaning of the story is that, and there is what I try, maybe my teaching background, that you can be a very shy person. When you are called to stand up to what is right, you will have the courage. And this is a story about being a very shy little girl who would never, under normal circumstances, have stood up and questioned a teacher. But because she was called upon it, as I say, her fearful heart became full of courage. And I think it's, again, a lesson for us that we might not want to do this or that, but if we are called, we become ourselves. We stand up if we feel for what is right.
Hayo, in the second story, had to go back and assume his responsibilities. The
Yes.
same concept.
Yes, the same thing. And there it is also, I wanted to do both. I wanted the loyalty between the brothers, but it starts out, and that is a true story again, with the school incident. That, he went to a Jewish school. He lived very close to the estate, at that time. He could daily ride the streetcar to Berlin. And the teacher, that whole story is true. As a matter of fact, that same teacher left Switzerland and founded a school in America we found in here. They are still a relative with the school here in America. And there's even a person, she also wanted to join us tonight, who is was connected with the school. So that continued continued through, I mean, a true incident at the Berlin Jewish school in Switzerland. He left for America. He was killed, and the teacher still, we have contact with the teacher. I mean, the teacher is now dead too, but I mean the descendants of the teacher, and the school still exists.
So the story with the two brothers, there was a question, a couple of questions about that story. So even though there is the germ of truth in terms of the person who had the school and then went back to fight because of his brother, one of the questions was how do you know what the two brothers said to each other in Kiev since neither brother survived? Is that part your fictionalized version of this?
Right. That again, see, every story that I write is, I try to base it on facts. And the previous story before that is called Stalingrad, A Lifetime Later. And there I take really the facts and read a lot of historical articles and try to base it on facts. But when they were in the foxholes, of course, and the Panthers drove over them. Nobody know, but they felt what they said. All we know by a fact that it was freezing cold, that they had no clothing anymore, that they had nothing to eat, and that they were there, buried in there. And I have a whole section in there, which I put in italics to say that is my interpretation. I imagine, and that's what the writer's imagination is for, to see what might have happened if you are isolated at 19 and you're freezing, you have no, and that's a good example too of both facts, real facts, even historical facts, and then how I interpret the situation for the reader.
Right. Now, there is a comment, there's a couple of things. One, Pam was asking if maybe you could hold the book up a little bit more and just kind of show a few examples of the pictures inside, that there are pictures that you mentioned in there, so people would see what a lovely book it is. It really is very pretty.
It is beautiful.
Well,
Yeah, that's beautiful. So you have some different color plates.
Boom, that's an African, all over African people who watch will recognize the boom. That's the national African tree. So,
Wonderful.
Yeah,
and that beautiful cover. I want to hear the inspiration behind it. So what, and maybe the title too, and then how that came to fruition, because it really is an eye-catching cover.
Yes, and the thing is that the book cover kind of portrays what the book is about. You know, you might have not been there yet when I explained. The cover is the spirit of the book. It points you to the spirit of the book. And Gypsy is my interest in Gypsy's history and lore and what they can do. And I've always been fascinated by Gypsies. Now, yeah, since we're talking about covers, then you might also turn to the wonderful back. There are two absolutely marvelous comments on the back. One person we have here, the other person intends to join us, but probably is not here yet. That also tells us a lot what the book is about, if you read those two amazing comments, because those people have read the book and they still portray the spirit of the gypsy.
Yeah, there was a question that mentioned, that kind of goes to the book's what's in the book, and it talks about the book has such a variety of media and genres represented within it. So what is your favorite genre between essay, article, short story, or poem, that you have written, and why is that?
Probably, even I came late to it, the poem, because you can do it fast. You know, I like the stories, but it always takes more work. I can uh, write poems very easily and very quickly. Uh, I actually like all of them. I just try to immerse myself. I like also the ones for the teachers, especially as a teacher here. The story about the seven goats, which I took that project into the schools and told the story. And from the kindergartners up to fifth grade, after I told the stories, had to draw the what they had heard in the story. And the amazing thing was what came out, not in the discussions afterward, but what the kids drew. And with the help of the teachers and the administrators and counselors, we could learn so much more about the kids that they had expressed in their drawings. So I enjoyed that too, even though that's totally different from writing a poem, which I love. So, and you know, there are other things with Gypsy Spirit, which I said are going under the surface of things. There are people too. Well, Tanya here, I can't see her right now, but you know, going to these. I'm also a hypnotist, and so going to these retreats, which then the Houston Chronicle picked up and had published, or medical magazines picked up when I wrote the article about nothing but snake oil. So that's the variety, you know, of the things that are incorporated in there.
That's wonderful. Now, there was another comment from Jay to everyone. He says, I find that I'm enjoying reading this book a little bit at a time, apparently as you wrote it. Does it surprise you when someone does not just read it through?
No, not at all. I'm glad. I think the temptation is for all of us, and I'm an avid reader. I read a book or two a week. That we start slowing down when we read. You know, it's more like the old-fashioned storytelling, which is so great with our grandchildren, that we tell it slowly and often don't hesitate to repeat it. Because I think I catch it with my youngest grandsons. Oh, I think, oh, I told them the story already. And they say, oh, let me tell it again. Or like with my grandmother, when she had to go in the underground to find the penicillin. I asked her that story again and again. And my imagination grew as she told the story. You know, first was good that she finally got the drug, that she got penicillin, but it goes on and on. What was it like? Why was you afraid? Why did the American authorities have the penicillin and they were in Germany as the occupying army and the German population didn't have it? It goes on and on if you read a story slowly and repeatedly.
And then Claudia mentioned, what would have happened had that jewel not been saved for penicillin?
Well, I probably wouldn't have survived. We don't know, but most children I was for weeks and weeks, first time separated ever from my mother and my beloved grandmother. And I was for weeks and weeks in the children's hospital, and I saw one child after another die around me. They died in droves. And what was so difficult, not was because the separation, but you formed because you were hospitalized so long. I had diphtheria, and then I had scarlet fever, then I had the measles, and I had mumps. I mean, I had everything that children had until you were done with one illness and you got the other one from all the other kids and you stayed longer. So the penicillin, clearly, I was the only one in the ward that had the penicillin, so I survived. But a lot of them didn't. And I do have a story in here of my first friendship with a little boy who was in the neighboring bed with me, Eric. I remember him to this day. And we became friends because we were already better than the rest of the kids. So the nurses also allowed us to sit on the windowsill, which was a tall building and you could see down. It was very cold again. And my mother and grandmother took turns walking up and down every day till nightfall. So because we were separated, so we could wave. And Eric was sitting next to me, and he became my friend. And he also was one who came from a farm community. And so he got treats, which the rest of us didn't have anything. So he would share an egg with me, or he would tell me some about his animals. It was my first real connection to somebody besides my family. And I mean, to this day, I could sometimes have nightmares because the beds were so close, and I reached over and felt that he wasn't responding anymore. I was a storyteller. When he got depressed, I would tell him a story, and that night he wouldn't respond. And then later during the night, they wheeled him out, which they always did, since there were no parents there allowed. When a child died, you put the sheets over them and they wheeled the child out.
Oh my, that's hard to hear. It's really, it's amazing. I'm not surprised you remember this for so long, because it's so amazing. Now, Pam Knight did request that she become a co-host here for a second because she wanted to share a screen. So I believe Joe has made her a co-host. So Pam, if you do want to share a screen, you can certainly do that. She wanted to share some pictures about the book. In the meantime, I have a note to be sure to give a shout out to Jeff for the cover.
Yes.
Is that right?
To Jeff, to the cover, but I said I will thank my family because they have been so marvelous. But I will start to. Oops, there she is.
There she is. She wanted to give you more of a close-up.
Great. Yeah.
So that's the cover, so that you can really see it.
Yeah, that's a great.
And then if you want to take just a minute I can flip through the table of contents so you can kind of see how much, this is such a richly, and here's her dedication page. That's her girls who are on this call.
I thought parents and grandparents would at least get a smile out of a otherwise serious book.
And then so the structure of the book is she goes through stories of her childhood, and then she talks about nature and life choices and loss and love. So it's just such a nicely done book, full of photographs, both. Yeah, that I guess is Our Lady as a child.
And I might, sorry to interrupt, but point out that our grandson Caius did the drawings, and Jasmine already commented on that. She already sent us a. So all the grandkids at the end, they're all in there.
There's the picture that goes with the story that she told. So you can kind of see just how sweet this book is. She's got her family pictures, and here's some of the children's drawings. So I call it a good coffee table book. There we go.
Well, that's wonderful.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't want to overwhelm you, but you get an idea of how nicely this book is done.
Well, and since I wanted to wait, but the pictures, I owe a lot to the work of our youngest daughter, Cecile. She spent hours with me going through piles and piles. Should we take this picture of him climbing the tree, or should we do that when he has a rabbit by the ears? No. So to make that final choice with all the pictures was, right, Cecile? Months and months.
Well, I had one, maybe we can close out. I had one request from someone, from Julien, yeah.
Julien.
She asked if you might read, and maybe we could do this to kind of close out, if you might read one short poem from the book before we end. Would you be okay with that?
Sure. That's fine. One she probably has, let's see. I actually like the first one. The House of Childhood. We turn to the place where we first heard voices, smelled the air and tasted nourishment, where hands caressed or frightened us, where comfort was our cocoon or neglect made us shiver. The tears of harm are cold, the tears of joy warm as a lagoon. We carry the house of childhood within us, and spying through its translucent walls, we keep life at a distance or embrace it. There are more, and
That's
then
wonderful.
we might mention that. It's actually a request that our daughter Cecile had we should mention. Pam published other books of me. She especially published my recent collection, Reflection, and she published Just a Few Feathers, and she published my novella, Save the Last Kiss. So there are a lot of things, poetry and short fiction.
Wonderful.
You've been
Thank you so
prolific.
Thank you
You've
so
been
much.
prolific recently.
Yes, wonderful. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. It looked like we had over 30 people at different times. So it was I think this is just beautiful that everyone could be here to hear Uta on this. And again, as I mentioned, if anybody is here in Austin or in the US, if you'd like a copy of the book, feel free to call Malvern Books at 512-322-2097 or give us an email at info@malvernbooks.com. And Uta would come by and sign a book for you and we could send it out.
I will sign a copy. So please come and get a book.
Thank you so much, everyone. Okay.